Coming to the properties of synapse. Some of the properties are convergence and divergence. Many presynaptic neurons meet on a common focus on any single postsynaptic membrane called convergence. For example, in spinal motor neuron, some inputs uh, come from directly the dorsal root, some from the long descending spinal tracts, and many from interneurons. The axon of the most presynaptic neurons divide into many branches that separate out in different directions to end on many postsynaptic neurons is called as divergence. One-way conduction is another property. The synapses permits conduction of impulses in one direction only, that is from presynaptic to postsynaptic neuron. This is because the chemical mediator at the synaptic junction is located in the synaptic knob of the presynaptic fibers but not in the postsynaptic membrane. And another property is synaptic delay. When an impulse reaches the presynaptic terminus, there is a gap of about 0.5 milliseconds before a response is obtained in the postsynaptic neuron, which is called as synaptic delay. This is due to the time taken for synaptic mediator to be released and to act on the postsynaptic membrane. And its significance is the conduction along a chain of neurons is slow if there were many synapses in the brain. Okay, and it is possible to determine whether the given synapse is monosynaptic or polysynaptic. Property is synaptic fatigue or habituation. Here, repeated stimulation of presynaptic neuron lead to gradual decrease and finally disappearance of postsynaptic response. For example, in epilepsy. The fifth property is summation, where the hypothetic nerves neuron A and B converge on neuron X and B diverges on X and Y. A stimulus applied to A or B will set up an EPSP in neuron X. Here you can see the stimulation of A and B is going to set up action potential in X, the property of which is called as convergence. And or it is also a partial summation. And when the neuron B is stimulated repeatedly one after another, it is going to stimulate X and Y to produce action potential in them, and this property is called as divergence, and also it is an example of the temporal summation. So here, if A and B are stimulated at the same time, two areas of depolarization will be produced in X and their action will sum up is called as partial summation. If the neuron B is stimulated repeatedly, X and Y will discharge and it is called as temporal summation. Another property is occlusion. When two afferent nerves, A, which is supposed to be having 5 subunits, and B, which is again having 5 units, to a skeletal muscles are simultaneously stimulated, it is sometimes seen that the tension developed by the muscle under observation is less than the sum of tension produced by each afferent nerve stimulated separately, and this phenomenon is called as occlusion. This is because some of the motor neurons, which are common to both, are excited maximally when either A or B is stimulated separately. They give no greater response when A or B stimulated together. This decrease in response is due to the presynaptic fibers sharing postsynaptic neurons. Thus, the occlusion is due to the afferent fibers overlapping in their central distribution. Okay, so here this diagram shows that when A and B they are separately stimulated, they will be able to excite 5 neurons, and when they are stimulated together, they will be able to excite only 8 neurons, because some of the neurons they are common to both A and B, and this property is called as occlusion. Subliminal fringe. Subliminal means below the threshold and fringe means border. Thus, the postsynaptic neurons are said to be in subliminal fringe if they are not discharged by activity in the presynaptic neurons but do have their excitability increased. When two afferent excitatory nerves, that is nerve A, which is supposed to excite 3 units, and B, which is supposed to excite 3 units to a skeletal muscles, are stimulated at the same time, two areas of depolarization will be produced, and sometimes the tension developed by the muscle is greater than the sum of the tension produced by each afferent nerve stimulated separately. For example, when the neurons A and B stimulated simultaneously, they will be able to produce excitation in 3 neurons. But when they are stimulated simultaneously, they will be able to excite 8 neurons, which is more than 3 plus 3, that is 6. This occurs because there are some common neurons which are in subliminal fringe. So this occurs because effect of each depolarization while fully activating a certain number of motor neurons also acts on further number subliminally, and that some of these subliminally influenced motor neurons are common to A and B. As a result, subliminal excitation can thus sum up to produce threshold stimulation. So this is another example of spatial summation. The eighth property is synaptic plasticity. Plasticity means capability of being easily modulated or changed. Synaptic conduction thus can be increased, that is strengthened, or decreased or weakened on the basis of past experience. These changes can be presynaptic or postsynaptic and play an important role in learning and memory. Some of the forms of synaptic plasticity. Post-tetanic potentiation. Here, a brief tetanizing stimuli in the presynaptic neuron results in increased production of postsynaptic potentials lasting up to 60 seconds. It occurs due to the increased calcium in the presynaptic neuron, and hence the response is potentiated. Long-term potentiation. If post-tetanic potentiations get much more prolonged and last for days, it is called long-term potentiation. It is due to increase in the intracellular calcium in the postsynaptic neuron rather than presynaptic. It occurs in many parts of the nervous system, but it has been studied in greatest detail in hippocampus. There is also long-term depression. It is opposite to the long-term potentiation. It resembles LTP in many ways, but it is characterized by decrease in synaptic strength. It is produced by slower stimulation of presynaptic neurons and is associated with smaller rise in intracellular calcium than occurs in LTP. This phenomenon is commonly occurs in hippocampus and cerebellum. Another synaptic property is habituation. When the stimulus occurs again and again, the response to stimuli decreases. It is referred to habituation. Sensitization. It is the prolonged occurrence of increased postsynaptic responses after a stimulus to which an animal is habituated is paired once or several times with a noxious stimulus. It is due to presynaptic facilitation. Sensitization may occur as a transient response or if it is reinforced by additional pairings of noxious stimulus and the initial stimulus. It is mainly due to the calcium-mediated change in the adenyl cyclase that leads to greater production of cyclic AMP. So this diagram shows the site of the post-tetanic potentiation, the fatigue or habituation, which occurs mainly in the presynaptic membrane, where with the post-tetanic potentiation there will be increase in the calcium levels. And sensitization occurs because of the presynaptic facilitation, whereas long-term potentiation occurs because of the increase in the calcium levels, whereas long-term depression occurs because of the slow release of calcium or low levels of calcium in the postsynaptic membrane. there'll be the pH also is going to affect, where alkalosis, when pH increases, the neuronal excitability is markedly elevated, when in acidosis, where pH decreases, the neuronal excitability